pleasant and warm. Now into the evening, still plenty of cloud, which means it's going to remain fairly mild, but turning a little bit cooler across those clearer spells in Scotland, and still plenty of showers feeding into the Northern Isles. And for next week, it is generally a cloudier picture, still fairly dry across the south, but some rain and showers in the north, and feeling a little bit cooler here too.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
It's our summer spectacular. 3 top prizes that have to be won. There's cash. £15,000 in tax-free cash to spend on anything you like this summer. Plus a brand new iPhone 15 with a set of Apple AirPods. And if that wasn't enough, we'll also treat you to some fun in the sun with £500 to spend at your favourite UK attraction this summer. For another chance to win the iPhone, treats and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 28th of June. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
GB News is Britain's election channel.
And when the big stories break, we're tackling them on Britain's newsroom. When we disagree, and we disagree a lot, it's even livelier than normal.
We don't disagree that much.
We do.
His comedy, though, is revolting. I knew her, and unlike you.
That explains Beverly Turner's temperament.
It's a bit frosty in here, isn't it?
You'll have one of me one day.
Yeah, for dartball practice. Britain's newsroom on GB News. Weekdays, 9:30 a.m.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the argument. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Evening all, lovely people, fellow travellers. Welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, on radio and online. Tonight we'll be picking up again on a story I've looked at previously, which is to say the Scottish COVID inquiry, and eye-watering and breathtaking the testimony is too. Were do not resuscitate orders handed out during the pandemic unnecessarily? Or did everyone do exactly what they had to do in order to make sure COVID was contained as quickly as possible? All of that and more coming up, but first, an update on the latest news headlines.
Good evening from the GB newsroom. The top stories: a plan to force private schools to pay VAT could lead to larger class sizes, according to the Shadow Attorney General. The policy is expected to raise £1.5 billion a year, according to estimates by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Emily Thornbury says it's necessary to ensure there's enough money to feed school children.
What we need to do is we need to raise the money in order to make sure that children going to state schools have had breakfast. That's what our priority is, and we need to raise the money from somewhere. And what we're going to do is we are saying everything we're going to spend money on, we're saying where the money is coming from, because we will have a properly costed manifesto, and all our spending commitments will be costed, and we will be able to say where it comes from. And sure, you know, there may well be complaints about it. I understand that, but I'm afraid that if I have a choice between putting VAT on private schools and making sure that the children in my area can have breakfast before they start learning, I know where I am.
Conservative Party Chairman Richard Holden criticised the plan and says families and children will pay the price.
Emily Thornbury today has completely admitted that Labour's approach to taxing schools is going to mean larger class sizes for children right across the country, particularly in the state sector. The children are going to be paying the price for Labour's ideological obsession, with over £2,000 extra on tax for their parents and larger class sizes for children. It's children and families who are going to pay the price under a Labour government.
In other news, a woman in her 40s remains in hospital with life-threatening injuries after a ride malfunctioned at a funfair in South London last night. Lambeth Country Show in Brockwell Park reopened earlier today, but some rides remain cordoned off. Lambeth Council says an investigation is currently underway, which is being led by the Met Police and health and safety executives. A man in his 40s is also receiving treatment for potentially life-changing injuries, while 2 others were also injured. Former Scotland and Liverpool defender Alan Hansen is seriously ill in hospital. The club is providing support to the family of the 68-year-old, who retired in 1991 to start a successful career as a television pundit. In a statement, Liverpool FC said its thoughts are with their legendary former captain, and they've requested the family's privacy be respected. Michael Mosley's wife says she's devastated after his body was found on the Greek island where they'd been on holiday. Dr. Claire Bailey Mosley described her husband as wonderful, funny, kind and brilliant. And she said the family takes comfort in the fact that he nearly made it to safety after an incredible climb. Dr. Mosley, who was 67, was with his wife and friends at a beach on the island of Symi on Wednesday before setting off alone for a walk. His body was found around mid-morning today beneath a fence that runs around a bar on Agia Marina Beach, which is surrounded by hilly, rocky terrain. Labour is pledging to alleviate some of the pressure on overcrowded prisons with a plan to add 14,000 new places. It would see some prisons classified as sites of national importance, so ministers can take control of planning decisions. It comes after some inmates were released early due to severe overcrowding across the prison system. The government previously promised to deliver 20,000 new prison places by the mid-2020s. Just 6,000 have been created so far. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the problem is getting worse.
Well, I am critical of the Tories' early release scheme, because what's happened is that they're releasing early prisoners who should still be in prison. And that's a shocking state of affairs, and like the many problems that they have left for the country, if we do come into power, we're going to have to fix it. Now, that will involve building prisons, that will involve taking tough decisions, because the money's been allocated for prison building, but there are tough decisions about planning and getting those prisons up. But what we can't have is a continuation of this total mess.
And the world's grumpiest duck is celebrating his 90th birthday today.
And happy 2, happy 3.
Donald Duck, famous for his raspy speech and sometimes short temper, made his debut on this day, way back in 1934, in a short cartoon titled The Wise Little Hen. Tony Anselmo, who voiced the classic Disney character since 1985, thinks Donald has become even more relevant over the years, possibly thanks to the frustrations of modern life. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
was cold in Scotland this week, bitterly so. There was snow on the hills in the month of June. This is not unusual as it happens, but still, you feel it. Makes a person waken up and pay attention. The weathermen said that cold wind blew down from the Arctic. It made me think about the so-called climate crisis. The crisis the authorities and their lackeys keep squeaking about. The one we're told is all our fault on account of the cows and our gas boilers. That we're to blame for it. That crisis they used to call global warming. Despite the snow in Scotland, there were headlines about it having been the hottest May on record here in the UK. Record temperatures, apparently. So there you have it. Get told one thing, but see with your own eyes and therefore actually know something else entirely. While you're at it, ask the gardeners about the weather and the climate in Scotland, in Britain. Ask the farmers as well if you want to know what the weather has really been like. So I was thinking about how it was bitterly cold with snow on the ground in June, when at the same time we're being told by officialdom that what we're really experiencing is record high temperatures, a world at boiling point. All of it made me notice for the umpteenth time how we're routinely told one thing when what we feel, what we actually experience, is the opposite. And then I saw a headline in the Daily Telegraph. It read, COVID vaccines may have helped fuel rise in excess deaths. COVID jabs and excess deaths linked in the same sentence in an establishment rag after all these years. After all these years, when to say as much was to invite censorship at least. After all these years of so many of us knowing there could be something wrong with those jabs, having read independent data on the subject, for example. All the time, the establishment and the scientists and the media smeared anyone saying no to those experimental gene therapies was a dangerous granny-killing loon, apparently. Those COVID jabs are still available. Of course they are. For the elderly, for the young. And then came that headline. Not the one about snow in June, the one about COVID jabs and excess deaths. There was more news from the Scottish COVID inquiry last week as well, including testimony from Age Scotland, a national charity for the over 50s, about countless people being contacted by their GPs to see if they would accept DNA CPR orders, which is to say, do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Which is to say thousands of people were being asked by our NHS to accept that if they were to get ill, they should not expect paramedics or anyone else to help them. If their heart stopped or if they stopped breathing, was it OK with them if nothing was done to get their hearts going again or to get them breathing? The examples offered by the director of Age Scotland were chilling, he said. I would say as chilling as the wind that blew in Scotland this week. A 101-year-old war veteran from Glasgow who had a knock at the door and opened it to find an official handing him a piece of paper telling him to keep it by his bed. When his daughter found it later, by chance, she saw it was a DNA CPR. But her father was hard of hearing, and since that might make it hard for medics to communicate with him, it would be better if he just accepted the inevitable. All the time we were told it was about saving Granny. Or the 50-something woman, Fit, a runner who was contacted by her GP surgery to ask, since she too had hearing loss, if she would accept a DNA CPR. I'm certainly not having a go at Scotland here, far less the Scottish COVID inquiry. On the contrary, fair play to that inquiry for doing what no other equivalent has done, which is listening to the truth of the horror story that played out when the madness was fully in control. There was testimony too about care homes applying DNA CPR notes to every resident in their care without consent, a blanket decision taken to write people off. You might say sentencing them to death, even before any of them were ill. These were people locked in, many extremely distressed and vulnerable almost by definition. I say again, remember all the guff about how people from oldest to youngest, from centenarians to newborn babies, not forgetting pregnant women, had a duty to take those products in order not to kill Granny. Remember that? All the propaganda about the unjabbed being Granny killers in the making. I would say the testimony from the Scottish COVID inquiry, and let's accept it lightly, provides a glimpse of the picture across the rest of the UK. We just haven't heard the rest of it yet. I would say the reality laid bare by that inquiry suggests the authorities, more accurately, might as well have been saying, don't kill Granny, because that's our job. I say a cold wind has blown throughout the land, that it started in 2020 and that it's been blowing ever since. I read that headline in the Daily Telegraph, disgracefully long overdue, and know it comes as late as snow in Scotland in June. The same team that pushed the nonsense about COVID, about the jabs, about the need to lock down the entire country for months on end, to cover every face with a paper mask, to follow magic arrows on the floor tiles of shops, to stay 6 feet apart, the rule of 6 or of 9 at funerals, all of it. It's now clear the same team went on to spout nonsense about everything else, insisting the war in support of Ukraine was a war to defend democracy, when there is no democracy in Ukraine and all that's being defended is the money-making potential of the already rich. Telling us wind farms, solar panels and electric cars are green, saving the planet, when all of the above require the wholesale pillage of irreplaceable ecosystems in pursuit of rare earth elements, much of the work done by child slaves to make giant turbines that can't be recycled and must be buried in the soil at the end of their 20-year lifespans, along with the defunct solar panels full of toxic lead and cadmium, all of it certain to leak poison into the land and then the groundwater. None of it seems green to me. All of it looks, on the contrary, only about greed. More and more of us are aware of all this and talking about it. More and more of us have seen that whatever it is we're told about COVID, about war, about the climate, it looks like the opposite to us. Even as the truth of the so-called vaccines bubbles to the surface, the World Health Organization relentlessly pursues the globalist dream of overriding national sovereignty and putting all the most important decision-making regarding our lives into the hands of an unelected, unaccountable cabal. It's also obvious now, the falsehoods, the offering to us of a false narrative with false flags for good measure. By now, their bluff seems to run along the lines of hoping we just accept that while the mask has slipped and we know and they know we know, they're hoping to tough it out by shrugging as if to say, what are you lot going to do about it anyway? Those totalitarians have long since seen to it that they have it all. The money in private, secretive, unaccountable hands, the judiciaries, the mainstream media, the police, the civil servants, not to mention all the guns and all the drones. They've persuaded themselves that it simply doesn't matter what the hoi polloi think, far less say. It's the 80th anniversary of D-Day, when the thousands died seeking to gain a toehold on a European continent usurped by Nazis. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau dared to cast his shadow on Juno Beach, a graveyard of heroes, while he spoke about democracy under threat. Quote, "Our way of life didn't happen by accident," he invited himself to say, "and it won't continue without effort." This is the same Justin Trudeau who welcomed an actual Nazi, a veteran of the Waffen-SS, into the Canadian Parliament and joined every other parliamentarian in the room in giving him a standing ovation after hearing that same Nazi celebrated for his efforts to fight the Russians in World War II, the same Russians who were Canada's allies, all our allies, against Nazis. Don't forget, Trudeau is also on record describing those who challenged vaccine mandates or otherwise demanded the return of their freedom as racists, misogynists and right-wing extremists, seizing bank accounts in the process. And then this week I swallowed down more of my own gorge while supposedly British politicians like Sunak, Starmer, Mordaunt and others offered empty platitudes about sacrifice and defending Britain. More of the same politicians that have presided over a Britain without meaningfully defended borders, where our children are taught in school that British history is shameful history, that it's the history of imperialism and colonialism and endemic racism, where anything and everything from maths to the countryside is racist. Those politicians and others like them are from a class or perhaps an ideological clique that is embarrassed by what Britain has always been, embarrassed by the very sight of the British flag, a clique that stands by while patriots profess allegiance to that self-same Britain that the D-Day veterans and the D-Day dead fought and died to defend. They say one thing, that political class, that self-important hollow clique, in the run-up to yet another of the pantomimes we call general elections, while by their actions or inaction they see to it that anyone with a sense of place, of heritage, of culture, of belonging to what has been Britain the Britain of their fathers and grandfathers, is belittled at best or accused of hate crime at worst. Here's the thing, they and their kind, posturing as patriots, have betrayed these islands, dishonoured any ancestors who served, and sold the rest of us out to their paymasters, the elite. They betrayed us when they locked us in our homes. They've sold out those who love the homeland, who love family, and want little more than to raise that family in peace, with the freedom to aspire and make the best of themselves without the ceaseless interference of the state. Snow falls in Scotland in June on a planet said to be at boiling point, and the awakening wind blows cold, cold enough to have us open our eyes to the hypocrisy, as though hypocrisy was a big enough word to describe the behaviour of a dying animal so corrupted in its death throes that it dares to overlook the fact we will still be here with our heritage, our culture, our language and our faith long after they are gone. Joining me this evening is broadcaster, lawyer and futurist, I love that, futurist Andrew Eborn. Andrew, amongst much else, I spoke about D-Day. How did you feel watching our present crop of politicians posture as patriots?
Yeah, I felt very sad, and the reason I felt sad, we always say history repeats itself, and the reason history repeats itself, we don't learn the lessons from history. 80 years from D-Day, and you look at all the names and so on and so forth, rightfully being honoured and respected for what they've done. And we're on the verge of World War III at the moment, and the same thing can happen again. And it was Eagleman who pointed out, you effectively die 3 deaths. One is when your body gives up, the second is when you're put in the ground, and the third is that day when we cease to mention your name. And let us always hope that we never cease to mention your name, because behind all these statistics are real people. And this is my concern, is we're not learning those lessons. We're fighting wars in different places and so on and so forth. And the first casualty in war is always the truth.
It's the fact that, yes, to all of that, but it's also that it sounds just hollow script. You know, as I say, these are politicians who preside or take part in the diminishing of Britain and running down our history, running down so much of what it has been to be Britain. And they're working towards globalisation. You know, they're working towards, they're quite happy to see national sovereignty surrendered to the WHO, and yet we're supposed to take it seriously when they stand on hallowed ground like the beaches of Normandy and profess to want to defend Britain.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what I also find appalling. You're absolutely right. What I also find appalling is that it's politicised. So all the talk about today is not about respecting those who died. It's about Rishi left early. You know, they talk about that sort of stuff. So it's a political thing. Oh, what disrespect he showed to everybody because they're hoping they'll score a few more points in the polls. That's got to be wrong, hasn't it? And you're right, it sounds like hypocrisy. Standing there honouring the people who sacrificed their lives for a war they maybe didn't understand. And the shocking thing is looking at the ages of the people, you know, 18, 19, 20, they're kids on that sort of basis. And I think it's disrespectful, if you like, to politicise that sort of side.
A break already. After that, we'll take a closer look into what's actually being uncovered by the Scottish COVID inquiry.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Mervyn Kirsch was a boy when the war began. By D-Day, he was trained and ready to fight after years waiting.
It was taking a long time. I suppose I was an agitator.
He remembers reality unfolding to the sound of thumping guns.
In the morning, about 5 o'clock, they woke me up to say we were going towards France now, and I could see the outline in the dawn, and I could hear couldn't see, but I could hear the shells, big shells going overhead both ways. Nobody was bothering to fire at me, which was quite good. Then I began to feel nervous, and I sort of realised it's not just an adventure, it's actual world war.
Mervyn served in the Ordnance Regiment. His job was to get supplies like ammunition and vehicles onto the beach. When an advance party, including some of his friends, were destroyed, Mervyn stepped up.
The head of me went a reconnaissance unit. We were supposed to go on D+6, The reconnaissance unit was going D+2 to find a suitable site for 200 drivers and 1,000 vehicles, which we were going to stock, all kinds. They went across, but they didn't get across. They were torpedoed, the only boat torpedoed that day. I was put on a boat that night, any boat, going across, and told to find a suitable site for vehicles and men. So I just crossed over them, and I landed, got to the top of the cliff, and just with a strange driver in a track vehicle, told him just to drive down one of the roads and see what we can find.
The People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. GB News, Britain's election channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
If you want your news to be straight talking, this is the nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them. Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My first guest this evening is Bill Jolly, who has been a witness at the Scottish COVID inquiry, giving testimony. He's still awaiting answers after his father was discharged from hospital following a head injury and sent back to his care home with COVID in 2022 and later died. In 2020, I beg your pardon, and he later died. Bill joins me now. Hello, Bill. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, hello, Neil.
I think it would be really it would matter a great deal, I think, if you would describe what happened to your father in as much detail as you like, really.
Yeah, well, what happened to my father back in 2020 was he was in a care home in Aberdeen. He had a couple of falls that I didn't know about, but on the 11th of April 2020, he had two falls. He had a fall at 5 o'clock that evening where he banged his head on a toilet system, and the nurses at the time said, or the staff said, that, it seemed to be okay. At 11 o'clock the same night, that's the 11th of April 2020, he had a more serious fall. He fell onto the back of his head and required to be blue lighted into Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. Now, the other thing I must point out is that my mum and dad sadly both had forms of dementia and they shared a room in the same care home. I then had to try and find out what was going on. At that time, we were right into the early stages of the pandemic, as it was called, and I had great difficulty trying to find out exactly what was going on. And also I had to deal with my mother, who was extremely anxious and confused because she had dementia, trying to find out what had happened to my dad. My dad had suddenly disappeared. Over the next couple of days, various horrendous things happened, which are, well, I did say in my testimony to the COVID inquiry. My father had a couple of falls, serious falls, in the care Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. And I was told he didn't qualify. I don't know what the qualification was, because there had been COVID in the care home before, the week before, but he was tested for COVID and found to be positive. Now, I wasn't aware of how bad my father's head injuries were and his body injuries until he was sent back to the care home. Now, I fought hard, for obvious reasons, to prevent my father being sent back to his care home, because for one thing, he was sharing a room with my mother. He had live COVID diagnosed at the hospital, And I was told by staff he was in a terrible state. He had serious head wounds, which had to be stitched. He'd ripped his elbows, he'd ripped his shoulder, his knees. He had been in reasonably good health before he went in. I was told he was now doubly incontinent, incoherent. He was very disorientated, and I fought hard, speaking to the staff at the hospital, to prevent my father being discharged back to the care home. I also fought hard with the care home manager at the time not to take my father back in the state I believed he was in. However, I was also told at this point that my power of attorney, which I did try and exert, had been removed. I was told that it was irrelevant, that they had special powers. To this day, I don't know what the special powers were, that they had special powers and they would be sending my father back to where he lived, which was in the care home and with my mother. The next thing that happened was they intended sending my father back on the 13th of April, so it was within 3 days. And I tried to stop that, and I was told that it was under review. They were looking at medication. There was a problem with transport, and I had a very distressing night on the 13th. On the 14th, having not slept, I went out for a walk in the morning. I came back in at 9:10 in the morning to be told by my wife that my father was actually on his way back to the care home. I phoned the care home and I said, you cannot possibly take my father back. I believe he's badly injured in the care of the hospital. He's also got serious health problems now, and at that point the manager did not intend isolating my father. The assumption would be that my mother would have COVID and that was where he was going back to. I put severe pressure on them. I demanded an email or a text to say they would take responsibility for anything that happened to my mother. And they buckled at that point after speaking to an area manager, I believe, and my father was isolated in a small room in the upper floor, which I thought would at least protect my mother and maybe protect some of the people on the ground floor. I was sent a photograph, which I think I've supplied, of my father in the state he was in when he was released from hospital. And I was absolutely horrified. He looked like he'd been in a road accident, as you can see by his various head injuries, stitching, a severely swollen side of his head, and I was absolutely shocked. And I spoke to staff also in the intervening sort of 10 days, 12 days before he died, and his deterioration was massive. So he never really recovered from being in hospital, not so much the head wound he got in the care home, but he never recovered from the injuries, in my opinion, that he received in Aberdeen Royal Infirmary.
I have a statement from the care home in question saying, while we cannot comment on the circumstances of individuals who have resided within our care homes, furthermore, the care home added they followed all guidance from Public Health Scotland and legislation from the Scottish Government at every stage of the pandemic. You know, how would you react to what certainly sounds like a fairly pro forma response?
Well, the big problem that I uncovered was that the hospital blamed the government. Initially, when I put in a formal complaint to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, they made out they were acting on instruction. So I take it that as from Nicola Sturgeon. I don't know if Jean Freeman was in place at that time, but that they had instructed the hospitals to do what they were doing. Interestingly enough, we did get eventually, after a lot of pressure, we did get a letter. I suppose you could say it was an apology, because it was the head of infectious diseases that we eventually got a meeting with, because I got a Dear John letter, is the best way to describe it at first, and I rejected it. I said, I'm sorry, you know, I'm not accepting this. So my wife and I were invited in to meet a few members of staff. And it was admitted then that the wrong decision was made, that my father should not have been, and I don't know if that was based on his COVID, I believe it was based on his injuries, that they made the wrong decision, but the decision was made. And my father was put back into a care home that lost, I think, about 7 or 8 people out of 28 to COVID. Well, COVID on their death certificates.
Bill Jolly, I've run out of time with you, but I'm so grateful to you for bringing this testimony about just a single example there of what happened to a loved one in a care home, you know, during that period. And I'll be endeavouring to bring much more testimony from that inquiry into the light. But thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Okay, Neil, I appreciate your help. Thank you.
We're going into another break, after which were do not resuscitate orders handed out during the pandemic unnecessarily? Don't go anywhere.
Good evening, welcome to your latest GB News weather from the Met Office. So plenty of rain around for many of us overnight tonight, but there will be some drier and brighter interludes to start on Monday. This frontal system sinks its way south and eastwards overnight Sunday and into the start of Monday, but high pressure is never too far away out towards the southwest. Those frontal systems bring areas of rain that have affected Northern Ireland today across parts of Wales, central and northern parts of England through the early hours of Monday morning. Generally turning drier across Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland, where it's likely to turn chilly under those clear spells, perhaps a touch of grass frost in places, but a much milder start across much of England and Wales, and quite a damp start too, as that area of rain slowly pushes its way south and eastwards through the morning. For Scotland though, despite a chilly start, there will be plenty of sunny spells through the morning. Across the very far north, plenty of showers though, pushing their way southwards as we go towards the afternoon. But for southern parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, even northwestern parts of England, plenty of sunny spells to start the day. Wales will also see some sunshine through the morning, but for much of England, it's generally a cloudier start to the day, and that heavy rain could cause some disruption during the morning rush hour. That rain continues to push its way eastwards as we go through the rest of Monday morning and in towards the afternoon, but closely followed by plenty of heavy showers pushing their way southwards. These perhaps turning quite persistent across parts of Scotland, and they could be quite heavy in places. The best of the sunshine across parts of Wales and southwest England, but temperatures still disappointing for the time of year, only 18 or 19 degrees in the south and around 10 to 12 degrees further north. Tuesday generally starts a little bit dry though. There will still be plenty of showers around, particularly across parts of Scotland and along eastern coasts as well, and generally a bit of a cloudier day, particularly as we head towards the afternoon. The showers perhaps not quite as heavy in eastern parts of England as they're going to be on Monday, but still some showers around on Wednesday as well. There is further outbreaks of rain likely on the way through Wednesday and Thursday, but temperatures are slowly on the rise.
This is GB News, and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but it's actually about you.
And we won't ever forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
Now more than ever, it's important to hear
all sides as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
GB News is Britain's election channel.
And when the big stories break, we're tackling them on Britain's newsroom. When we disagree, and we disagree a lot, it's even livelier than normal.
We don't disagree that much.
We do.
His comedy, though, is revolting. I knew her, unlike you.
That explains Beverly Turner's temperament.
It's a bit frosty in here, isn't it?
He'll have one of me one day.
Yeah, for dartball practice. Britain's newsroom on GB News. Weekdays, 9:30 a.m.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. We now continue talking about the findings, the testimony coming out of the Scottish COVID inquiry. I'm joined by former doctor, pharmaceuticals expert and barrister, Dr Jonathan Engler, to ask about do not resuscitate orders and the way in which they were used during the pandemic. Was it unnecessary? Thanks so much, Dr Engler, for coming in.
Thanks for having me on.
Give us a bit of a sense of the way in which these do not resuscitate orders were used and what they traditionally mean.
Well, the traditional meaning of a do not resuscitate order, or how many people interpret it, is that cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, won't be attempted when a person reaches a cardiac arrest. But as I think you've had John Campbell on here before, and as he says, and as is my memory of clinical medicine, is once a do not resuscitate order is applied to somebody, that colours the whole way in which that patient is treated. They're effectively seen as end of life, even though they may not be. So there are some quite draconian implications to having a DNR order applied. And of course, we heard in the Scottish inquiry how people were being phoned up by GPs saying, would you consent to having a do not resuscitate order applied? There were even instances where people had this applied where no conversation had been taken place, where it was in the notes at the end when they were discharged. They were surprised that that was applied. So there are some very, very serious questions to be asked.
Traditionally, if that's the right word, would it ever have been the case that someone who's healthy is asked to contemplate the arrival of circumstances wherein they would not be brought back to life? I would have thought a DNR would start to come in when somebody was so far gone, so ill in so many ways, that it would almost be a conversation and a process involving everyone else around that person.
Yeah, you would have thought so, but that seems to have been jettisoned during the COVID era. And I think the ethical justification for it is that we have to manage and maintain our resources for those people who are maybe got a greater chance of survival and so on. And this is a dangerous utilitarian slope, in my opinion.
Now, I think we do have some, we've got a clip of some of the proceedings relevant to this point about these so-called do not resuscitate orders.
My recollection is absolutely clear. There was discussions around age grouping for toe tagging. In other words, people over a certain age now, your normal attempts at resuscitation would be minimised, and as a consequence of the discussions, they were mentioned 70 and over initially.
In paragraph 28, you talk about rumours that the government, and I assume you mean the Scottish government, but I'd be grateful if you clarify, had a plan to reduce that age group you were talking about to the over 50s.
Yeah.
Did that ever amount to more than rumour? I mean, as you'll appreciate, we're obviously looking at the Scottish government's strategic response.
It was absolutely in discussion now, and they had a kind of 70, 60, 50 now escalating process.
For the untrained eye, it feels as though the very health professionals upon whom we would depend for sober and serious contemplation of something as sacred, really, as a DNR, it was almost as though they were being barrelled along by the rest of the propaganda, or at least the publicity that was saying that what was coming at us was going to be overwhelming, and they were almost acting before it had happened by taking actions like these.
Well, of course, and in fact, what the result of some of these incidents would have been is that some people would have died, and people would have been surprised, possibly, that some people died, but that would have fed into a positive feedback loop in which people, including medical professionals and healthcare professionals, perceived this disease as much more deadly than it actually was. And then, of course, there would have been even more willingness to apply do not resuscitate orders and so on. So it's a positive feedback loop. And I think that a lot of people struggle with the idea that healthcare professionals can be involved in a series of actions which are ultimately harmful to the patient. But that historically there are many precedents for that. You don't have to go very far back to see medical professionals being involved. And there is a saying that more harm was done to people by people that thought they were doing good than by people that thought they were doing evil. And to take one example from history, I'm sure some people know about the story of frontal lobotomy, but frontal lobotomy, the person who came up with the idea of frontal lobotomy, a Portuguese surgeon, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1949, and by 1949 10,000 frontal lobotomies had been performed, and virtually every single one was left in a zombie-like state. So it shows you that it's not as black and white, the people to say, well, doctors would never do that. Sometimes people get swept along. I mean, there are more recent examples of that, which are controversial. I have my own views on it, I'm sure you do as well, as gender reassignment surgery to children. I mean, some people would consider many cases of that to be effectively institutionalised abuse.
And to get back to the do not resuscitate orders, there's been testimony coming out of the inquiry saying that whole care homes, all residents, regardless of their actual circumstances, were issued with these orders in advance of them actually being ill, you know, which again sounds like something that was snowballing down from on high and sweeping maybe care home staff along with it.
Yeah, and that's very shocking, and it's completely consistent with my own research into that area.
Well, it's scandalous, isn't it? I mean, it then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're turning around to people and saying, there is no hope for you. As soon as something happens, well, we're not going to go any further. And as you say, if you're working on the basis that it's around the world, then sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need to call that out, get the evidence, because we're so reliant these days on experts, aren't we? And I think you have to question those experts.
Yeah, we do.
Dr. Engler, I almost don't know where to begin with this kind of testimony, but thank you so much for coming in and just beginning to enable us to properly to process you know, what seems to have been going on during the last few years.
Thank you for having me on.
It's going to be an ongoing story, and I'll hope we can maybe look forward to further contributions from you. Thank you very much. Another break, here we go again. I will be joined after that by a GP with a slightly different take on the situation. Please don't go anywhere.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is about the Biden administration kind of resisting calls from Harry's lawyers whether or not this ongoing thing about releasing his visa records over the alleged, in Spare, he admitted to taking, remember his memoir Spare? He admitted to taking cocaine, marijuana and magic mushrooms. And a lot of people are saying, was he honest and truthful in his application, in his visa application? You have to say, have you taken drugs? He said no, and then in Spare he said yes. So I think this is absolutely fascinating. They're saying they can't release these records because there is a stigma attached to law enforcement records. Yes, there's a stigma attached to that, but then don't say... I mean, you know, everybody else, if you write yes on a visa application, you will be chucked out of the United States. You will be denied entry. So I think this is fascinating that on this issue of whether there is a stigma for Harry or not, he can have his law enforcement records not released into the public domain.
The bottom line is, do we want him back?
So what's interesting is it seems to be becoming a political dividing line in the States because Biden is the administration trying to do Harry a favour by keeping them under wraps, but Trump has promised that he will, you know, that the file will be made public if he wins again.
Trump's been very strong on this. He said, you know, if Harry lied, then he's out.
The one thing about America is their politicians make ours look sane. Which is saying something.
I'm slightly confused about this whole story because, OK, sure, Prince Harry has said this. How many pop stars, rock stars, movie stars, like every
the difference is, well, I don't think it's just British. I think millions of Brits, to be fair to them, lie on the form every year. Millions of people from around the world lie on the form every year. Not, of course,
I'm not going to name any pop star specifically, but I would be mightily surprised if any hadn't indulged in what...
Yes, but of course they haven't given written evidence in their biography that they have, and that's the difference.
Britain's election channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the argument. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got, in my opinion? The best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes,
she could have saved Storm.
You made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
Went everywhere. Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. More from the Scottish COVID inquiry now. Here is a clip that features Adam Stakura, the head of policy and communications at Age Scotland, who said a man of 101 years of age was given a do not resuscitate notice during the pandemic because he was hard of hearing. Take a listen.
He was a 101-year-old veteran living in Glasgow who one day got a knock at the door from paramedic and was handed a bit of paper, and they told him, just keep this by your bed. And he dutifully said yes, of course, and she'd gone round to visit. This was later on in the year, and found it was a do not attempt resuscitation form, and under the reason for, it just said communication difficulties. And that's because he had hearing loss. And I think that in itself, there was no logic to this. And why you have to keep this by your bed. So if a paramedic, really chilling examples of how this is applied to people in quite a cavalier way at times, and of examples in care homes where a whole care home would be sort of every single resident would have been issued or a DNR decision made in their name, and sort of a blanket decision, but with no real individual clinical assessment.
I'm joined now by Dr. David Lloyd, a general practitioner from North London. Thanks for joining us this evening, Dr. Lloyd.
Thank you.
What do you make
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome, you're welcome. What do you make of that testimony that we just listened to there? You know, given what most of us would assume would be the absolute seriousness of the very idea of a do not resuscitate notice.
Golly, I mean, I could talk for ages and ages about this, so do tell me if I'm going to bore you. But I think people misconstrue what the DNAR is. It's a DNA CPR. So what we're talking about with patients is that if their heart stops, we won't try any artificial way of getting the heart going again. Now, most people think that by doing that, you're really saying that you're dooming that patient to die. But in fact, we're talking about a group that probably are going to die anyway. A successful resuscitation using CPR is really only successful in about 10% of the time, and that's when you're in hospital. If your heart stops when you're out of hospital, your chances of being resuscitated are incredibly low.
What about the idea, though, as Adam Stakura was testifying there at the inquiry of people being handed these notices in advance of any unwellness, and not just the 101-year-old veteran from Glasgow. He also testified about a 50-something lady who was apparently very fit, a runner, as a hobby, and she was contacted by her surgery and asked if she would take a DNA CPR notice because she too suffered a degree of hearing loss. How would you react to that?
Well, of course, we would all react with horror if that was the only reason. But don't forget, we were faced with the potential collapse of the health service with the COVID epidemic. Because we went into lockdown too late, we were having to fight fires all over the place. And yes, we did take terrible decisions during that time when we had to try and work out those are the patients that might stand a chance if they got the best possible care in restricted circumstances, or those who were inevitably going to die. And speaking as someone who ran a community COVID hub during those 2 years, those terrible 2 years, I found it was terribly difficult watching the patients that I would admit to hospital, knowing that a quarter of them would be dead by the end of the week. And so I found myself sometimes having to suggest to relatives that they say their goodbyes with me before they went into hospital because they wouldn't see their loved ones again. So we had to make some terribly difficult decisions faced with the enormity. We now know the most enormity is that 220,000 people died in this country from COVID.
Difficult decisions or wrong decisions. The very idea of thousands of people being contacted over the phone by GPs, surgeries, receptionists, people in good health with no particular being asked if they would, if it was okay with them if they had a DNA CPR notice lodged against them in the event of their becoming unwell at some point in the future. I mean, surely that's not just a difficult decision, but the wrong decision.
Well, can I push back? It wasn't receptionists. a lot of doctors spend an awful lot of time talking to an awful lot of patients about the decision about what they want to do about that. And research has shown that people like talking about DNA CPRs, particularly when they're coming to the end of their lives, and actually appreciate it. And in fact, I can actually quote some research here if you're interested. But a study done by the Medical Law Review actually showed that more discussion took place during COVID than before COVID took place. So there was more logical discussion about end-of-life care during the COVID pandemic than there was before COVID actually started.
Hold that thought, please, Dr. Lloyd. Andrew Eborn, how do you react to what the doctor is saying there? You know, this idea that people were being just invited to contemplate the end, even before they were unwell.
I think there's a couple of points to make on this. Firstly, I absolutely believe that doctors wanted to try and do the best. I think that's the fundamental point. A couple of things the good doctor mentioned. They took terrible decisions, were the words that he talked about, and we would all act with horror if it was just communication difficulties. So the evidence will come out on that sort of bit. So the point I was making earlier about informed consent, and I'm sure the doctor, the good doctor, would turn around and say that if they weren't given all the circumstances, given all the necessary information, because the suggestion earlier on in the programme was that actually those who did consent to having this the do not resuscitate CPR were basically given worse treatment, or were not given proper treatment as a result of it. Again, the evidence will establish that. I'm not an expert in these sort of things, but I'd like to hear the doctor on that particular point. So if it was just communication difficulties, that we would all act with horror. That's a legitimate point. But secondly, did they get worse treatment as a result?
What about that? I'm really asking for your opinion, Dr. Lloyd. Does it not set people on a pathway to palliative care if it's in everybody's head that this person is being talked about in the context of a do not resuscitate order?
So again, I think we're concentrating on a very narrow aspect, which is the actual DNA CPR form. But what was much more difficult for us was this whole concept of ceiling of care, as we call it. So we would have to make decisions on every patient who was very ill in the hospital or very ill in the community. We have to do this all the time, is what level of care should we provide to this patient with this particular condition with the previous comorbids? And that's the really big discussion. DNA CPR is small fry compared to hearing about the terrible and very difficult and very complicated decisions that we all make about patients every day.
Thank you for your time this evening, Dr. David Lloyd. I'm just running out of time again. I don't know what a conversation that is that we have to cut short. Andrew Eborn, you know, the very idea that people, as far as I'm concerned, were being written off in advance of being taken unwell and shown the exit door, you know, before anything else. Out of time. Thanks for watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. I'll be talking to Adam Stakura in the second hour. You can catch that second hour with extended interviews over on GB News. Thank you, Andrew Eborn. Don't go away.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather from the Met Office. So plenty of rain around for many of us overnight tonight, but there will be some drier and brighter interludes to start on Monday. This frontal system sinks its way south and eastwards overnight Sunday and into the start of Monday, but high pressure is never too far away out towards the southwest. Those frontal systems bring areas of rain that have affected northern